Now we're going to talk about how we measure personality. We talked in the last two times about what personality is, and now we're going to talk about how you measure it. How do you take an individual, give them a test, and from that test have an understanding of what their personality is about. And there are two kinds of tests that we can give. There are unstructured tests, and there are structured tests. And the test primarily depends upon your particular theory of personality. For example, the unstructured tests were designed primarily from psychodynamic theory, from the theory of Freud and the Neo-Freudians. And so they're unstructured because we want to try to get at what their unconscious traits are. Typically, in an unstructured test, you present some ambiguous stimulus, like a picture, or in the famous unstructured test, an ink blot, and you ask people to describe what they see in that ambiguous picture. So it's designed to assess unconscious traits or unconscious conflicts. They're called implicit. The second is the structured tests. And the structured tests tend to come from more the data-based theories. And typically what you do in a structured test is you present a long list of questions, and the person taking the test simply answers those questions by self-report. And the idea is that here we are looking at actual traits. So we're probably reflecting explicit personality, because they have to describe what their personality is. Okay, the unstructured tests are sometimes called projective tests, because you're projecting your personality and your inner feelings onto the test itself. And we're going to look at two today: the thematic apperception test, the TAT, and the Rorschach test, or the inkblot test. And these are the two most commonly used projective tests. And we're going to look at two structured tests. We're going to look at the Minnesota Multiphasic Personality Inventory, the MMPI, very commonly used test for years. And it probably measures personality more in the context of people that have psychological disorders. In other words, it says, is your personality like someone who has neurosis? Or is your personality like someone who has depression? So it's actually looking at classifications of psychological disorder as well as normal personality, the Minnesota Multiphasic Personality Inventory. And then the most popular newer test, is the NEO Personality Inventory, measuring the big five traits that come out of that theory of personality. So let's look at those. The thematic apperception test will present pictures. This is an actual picture from the test, at least one version of it. And what you're told to do is tell a story that will end up with this scene. So what caused this scene? Tell a story. And the person simply tells a story, and then that story is interpreted by the examiner, the person giving the test. So people project their feelings about the pictures by telling the story that leads up to the scene in the picture. So we want the story to bring out the unconscious feelings and motives. I want to point out, though, that the evidence for the validity of the thematic apperception test is very weak. Validity is how well it really does measure personality by comparing it to other personality measures. That's hard to do with projective tests, by the way. Then there's the Rorschach test, or the inkblot test, where you're shown inkblots like this and asked to interpret them. The Rorschach has 10 inkblots, 5 in black and white, and 5 in color, like the ones you just saw. And the test assumes that when describing the inkblot, they're going to project themselves onto the design. They're going to interpret that inkblot by using your unconscious feelings and unconscious personality. One of the first of the structured tests I want to talk about is the Minnesota Multiphasic Personality Inventory, the MMPI, a very common used test to measure personality. And it really is different from the others we're going to talk about, because here the MMPI is designed to look at personality as it correlates with the personalities of people that have particular psychological disorders. It looks at personality, normal sort of traits, but it also looks at these traits that are displayed by people that have those disorders. And I'll show you what the scales are. It has 550 questions. It's directed at 10 scales or subtests, each measuring a separate trait, with over 40 subscales. So it's a very wide array of information can be derived from using the MMPI. The items were chosen, as I mentioned, that distinguish between psychiatric patients or people with psychological disorders and normal people. And this is a profile from an administration of the MMPI, and it gives you a standard score on each of these 10 scales. And the 10 scales are hypochondria, depression, conversion hysteria, psychopathic deviant, masculinity femininity, paranoia, neurosis, schizophrenia, hypomania, and introversion. So it has major scales that deal with regular personality traits like introversion, but then it has scales that really deal with clinically relevant traits displayed by people with that disorder, like, for example, depression and schizophrenia. It also has some interesting scales, 4 scales that are called validity scales, that give you information about how the person is answering the test. One is simply looking at the number of questions that are unanswered, the question scale, a lying scale, and most large structured tests have a lying scale, especially when you're looking at something which is personality, because they might want to try to give you the very best impression of what their personality is. So not answering the questions truthfully, they really are representing someone who has a personality better than theirs, and the scale tries to measure that. It's also looking at a scale called frequency, which answers that seem haphazard, they don't seem to be reliable, they don't seem to be consistent in the way they're dealing with the questions. And then it has a 4th validity scale, where you simply are answering the questions as if you're denying that you have problems. Because remember, this is one that's used to correlate this personality with personalities of people that have psychological disorders. The Minnesota Multiphasic Personality Inventory. Then the final structured test I want to talk about is the NEO Personality Inventory, again developed by Paul Costa and Robert McRae at the National Institutes of Health Intramural Program in Baltimore. And it measures the big 5, those 5 scales that we talked about as being the major traits of personality: openness to experience, conscientiousness, extroversion, agreeableness, and neuroticism. The big 5 scales of personality. Now, the NEO has 240 items measuring the big 5. Items are a description of behavior, like I like to talk with friends, a behavior, and you would answer it on a 5-point scale from strongly agree on one side to strongly disagree on the other. So you're getting an idea on a 5-point scale of the extent to which that behavior describes you. And it's intended to be used for people over age 17. It's not one designed for children, even though they've administered it to children, and you'll see that in a minute. And people without obvious pathologies, because remember, it's not like the MMPI. Here we want to look at normal personality and personality that's explicit, conscious. This is a study that was done by Roberts and his colleagues and published in the Psychological Bulletin, which looks at the stability of personality as measured by these trait tests. And you can see that the stability in adults is pretty good, and maybe not so good in young people. In children, the stability is from taking the test and then taking the same test 7 years later. So it's looking at whether or not you have change or stability over that period. Children, about 0.30, 30% stability. With college students, it goes up above 50%, above 60% in young adults, and in older adults, goes up to above 70%. So in adults, it's more stability. You see more stability than you see in children and young adults. And the best stability is actually when you're 50 or older. So these tests are stable. They do have validity measures. They are reliable. In other words, these are the ones that you would use if you wanted to get a very objective measure, a standardized measure of personality. Thank you.